Hi, my name's Mark, and my wife, Madison, she's 35. Well, I started suspecting her of cheating recently, and as it turns out, I had good reason. You'll be shocked when you hear the story to the end. I didn't suspect her at first. I mean, why would I? We'd been married for 10 years, built a life together, and shared what I thought was an unshakable trust. But everything changed one night when I came home early from a late meeting. I walked into the house, expecting to find Madison curled up on the couch with her favorite reality show. Instead, I found her in the kitchen, hurriedly ending a phone call. Her tone was soft, her voice almost nervous. She hung up the second she saw me and gave me a smile, but it was forced. I asked her casually, "Who was that?" "Oh, just Derek, work stuff," she said, brushing it off. Derek was her boss, a name I'd heard often, but always in passing. I shrugged it off too for a while, but over the next few weeks, there were little things. The way she suddenly started staying late at the office, the new dresses she bought just because, and that smile she'd give her phone, quickly tucking it away when she caught me looking. The real kicker came at the company gala. Madison wore a dress I'd never seen before, a bold crimson gown that turned every head in the room. I was proud at first. She looked stunning. But then Derek walked over. His smirk when he greeted her sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just a look of admiration, it was a look of ownership. I couldn't shake the feeling after that gala. You know that gut instinct? The one that keeps poking at you even when you tell yourself everything's fine? That's where I was. For days, I replayed every little detail. The way Madison leaned in a little too closely when Derek whispered something to her. The way she laughed at his jokes, like he was the funniest man in the room. And that smug look Derek shot me as if he knew something I didn't. But I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. I told myself it was harmless. Madison was driven, professional, and smart. Why wouldn't her boss admire her? Still, the doubt lingered. Life went on, but little things started piling up. Madison began spending more time at work. "Deadlines," she said with a tired smile. "Derek's got me working on something huge. It's stressful, but it's a big opportunity." I nodded, telling myself it was normal. She was ambitious, and I'd always admired that about her. But then came the late-night texts. One evening, she was in the living room, folding laundry while I finished cleaning up in the kitchen. Her phone was charging on the counter, and it buzzed. I glanced at the screen out of habit. "Can't believe how much fun last night was." "You're amazing. Let's make it a regular thing, Mr. D." My chest tightened. Fun last night? What the hell did that mean? I told myself it could be harmless, but something about the tone of the message and the fact that Derek was texting her after hours felt wrong. I didn't mention it, not yet. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Over the next week, Madison's schedule became even more hectic. She left early, came home late, and was glued to her phone at all hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me. One Saturday, she announced she was going to yoga with some coworkers. "It's a great way to de-stress," she said, tying her sneakers. "Yoga, huh?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, and she'd never mentioned being interested in yoga before. "Yeah, Jenna from the office swears by it," she said, grabbing her mat and keys. "See you in a couple of hours." I watched her drive off, the unease in my gut growing stronger. After a moment's hesitation, I walked over to the garage, where she usually kept her gym bag. Her yoga mat wasn't there. When she returned later, she was unusually cheerful, practically glowing. "How was yoga?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Great," she said, grinning as she sipped her water bottle. "I'm definitely going to make it a regular thing." That night, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone on the coffee table. It buzzed and a notification popped up. "Still thinking about how incredible you looked this morning. The way you moved, breathtaking." D. My heart pounded. I stared at the message, the words burning into my brain. I put the phone down quickly, not wanting to read anymore. When Madison came back into the room, she smiled at me. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. But in my mind, the doubt had grown into something I couldn't ignore. After those messages, my mind felt like it was running in circles. Was I overreacting? Misinterpreting things? Madison's behavior was strange, but maybe I was letting my imagination run wild. I needed to talk to someone. Someone who could help me see things clearly. I called my old friend Tom. We'd known each other since college, and though life had pulled us in different directions, he was still the guy I trusted most. He had a way of cutting through the noise and telling it like it was. "Mark," he said after I laid everything out, "you've got two options. You either confront her now and hope for honesty, or you dig deeper. But whatever you do, don't make a move without knowing the facts." "Easier said than done," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "I hear you, man," Tom said. "But let me ask you this. Do you know much about her boss, this Derek guy?" I paused. "Not really. Just what she's told me. He's ambitious, runs a tight ship, always pushing his employees to do more." Tom let out a low chuckle. "Ambitious, huh? That's one way to put it. I've heard things about him, nothing concrete, but enough to raise an eyebrow. He's got a reputation for getting Involved with his female employees. My stomach turned. You're serious? Yeah, Tom said. Look, I'm not saying Madison's mixed up in anything, but Derek's not exactly known for his boundaries. If I were you, I'd do some digging. His words stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, searching for anything I could find on Derek Caldwell. It didn't take long to find whispers of his reputation on forums and social media. A former employee had written a scathing review about his unethical behavior. Another post hinted at an affair that ended with the woman leaving the company. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Was Madison just another name on his list? The next day, I decided to take Tom's advice and dig deeper, starting with research. I found forums where people shared advice on handling suspicions of infidelity. One thread stood out, a detailed guide on surveillance tools for private use. It was like a crash course in spy gadgets, GPS trackers, hidden cameras, phone monitoring apps. I spent hours reading reviews and watching tutorials. The more I learned, the more confident I felt. If Madison was hiding something, I'd find out. That weekend, I ordered a GPS tracker online. It was small, discreet, and easy to install on a car. The website promised it could pinpoint a vehicle's location in real time. It arrived a few days later, and I tucked it away in the garage, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, I kept things normal at home, or at least I tried to. Madison didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I caught myself overanalyzing every little thing she did. When she smiled at her phone, I wondered who she was texting. When she left the room to take a call, I strained to hear her voice. One evening as she worked on her laptop in the living room, I casually asked, "What's your project about anyway? You've been spending so much time on it lately." She didn't even look up. "Just a market analysis. Boring stuff, really." Her response was so dismissive, it made my skin crawl. I nodded and walked into the kitchen, pretending to grab a drink, but my mind was racing. That night, I finally got my chance. Madison mentioned she needed to pick up groceries and would be gone for about an hour. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed the GPS tracker and installed it under her rear bumper. It clicked into place easily, and I tested the app on my phone to make sure it worked. It did. When Madison came home, I acted as if nothing had happened. She handed me a receipt from the store, kissed me on the cheek, and went to put the groceries away. But now, I had a way to know where she went and how long she stayed there. The GPS tracker gave me a strange sense of control, like I was finally doing something instead of sitting around with my doubts. I didn't check the app obsessively at first. I told myself I'd only use it if Madison's behavior gave me a reason to. It didn't take long for that reason to appear. A few days later, Madison announced she was meeting a coworker for lunch. "It's just a quick catch-up," she said, pulling on her coat. "Jenna wants to go over some ideas for the project." I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. "Sounds good. Say hi to Jenna for me." As soon as she left, I opened the tracking app. Her car was moving steadily toward downtown, just like she said. But instead of stopping near one of the casual lunch spots she usually liked, it parked in the lot of a high-end hotel. My chest tightened. I stared at the blinking dot on the map, willing it to move somewhere else. Minutes passed. She stayed at the hotel. I told myself it could still be innocent. Maybe they were using the hotel's conference rooms. Plenty of professionals did that, right? But the longer the dot stayed in place, the more my hope eroded. When Madison came home that afternoon, she was upbeat and chatty. Lunch was great. Jenna had some really creative ideas. "I think we're finally getting somewhere with this project." "That's good to hear," I said, trying to keep my voice even. She didn't mention the hotel. Not a single word. That evening, I called Tom again. "She went to a hotel," I said, pacing the living room. "She told me she was having lunch with Jenna, but her car didn't move for over 2 hours." Tom let out a low whistle. "That doesn't look good, man." "What do I do?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Keep gathering evidence," he said firmly. "If you confront her now, she'll just deny everything. You need something solid. Have you thought about checking her phone?" I hesitated. "She keeps it locked. I don't know her password." Tom was quiet for a moment. "There are apps that can help with that. You'd have to install it on her phone, though." "Could you do it without her noticing?" "I think so," I said, my mind racing. The next day, I started researching phone monitoring apps. Most of them required physical access to the device for just a few minutes. Enough time to install the app and set it up. I found one with good reviews and purchased it, then waited for the right opportunity. That evening, Madison was in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone while I sat in the living room pretending to watch TV. "Hey, can you grab my charger from the kitchen?" she called out. I jumped at the chance. "Sure." As soon as she left her phone on the nightstand, I slipped into the room and grabbed it. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. Thankfully, I knew her code. It was her birthday, a habit she'd never bothered to change. I installed the app as quickly as I could, setting it to forward her messages and call logs to my email. Just as I put the phone back in its place, Madison walked back into the room. "Find it?" she asked, holding out her hand for the charger. Yeah, here, I said, forcing a smile. The next day, the app started sending notifications to my email. Most of it was mundane texts to Jenna about work, reminders from her calendar. But one thread stood out. It was a conversation with Derek. His messages were flirty, filled with casual compliments. You're always so impressive in meetings. That dress you wore last week? Stunning. But then there was one that made my blood run cold. Last night was amazing. You're incredible. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Last night? She hadn't mentioned seeing Derek outside of work. I tried to remember what she'd told me about her evening. Something about staying late to finish a report. The lie was so seamless, so practiced. I forwarded the messages to a separate email account, one she didn't know about. If this was going where I thought it was, I'd need every shred of evidence. By the time I had all those messages in my inbox, the gravity of what might be happening began to sink in. I hadn't confronted Madison yet. I wasn't ready. Every time I thought about looking her in the eye and demanding the truth, I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. Instead, I spent more time thinking, analyzing, obsessing. That night, after Madison went to bed, I sat out on the patio with a cup of coffee, staring at the dim glow of the backyard lights. My thoughts spiraled into 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just Derek, or were there others? Had she ever felt guilty? I thought back to all the little moments I'd brushed off. The times she'd come home late, claiming she'd stayed at the office to get ahead. The sudden wardrobe upgrades. The way she'd been pulling away from me. Not all at once, but gradually, like a slow leak in a tire I hadn't noticed until the whole thing went flat. I gripped the mug tightly, my knuckles turning white. How could she do this? We'd been married for almost 12 years. When I looked back at the vows we exchanged, the promises to love and honor each other, they felt hollow now. Maybe they'd always been hollow for her. I shook my head, trying to pull myself out of the pit I was falling into. But it wasn't just anger that consumed me. It was the loss of trust. Trust isn't something you can fake. It's not a switch you can flip on and off. It's built over years, through countless shared moments, and when it shatters, it doesn't just crack, it disintegrates, leaving behind a gaping void. I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream, cry, or punch something. None of it would fix what was broken. But sitting there, in the quiet of the night, I realized I needed answers, not just for my own sanity, but because I couldn't move forward without knowing the full truth. I thought about all the times I'd trusted Madison implicitly, never questioning her motives. Now every memory felt tainted. Was I blind? Or was she just that good at lying? The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed time to think, to plan. As I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched breakfast, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom. How are you holding up, man? I hesitated before replying, not great. Can we meet later? I need to talk. Tom agreed, and by noon, we were sitting at our usual spot, a small diner on the edge of town. He didn't even wait for me to start before diving in. So, what's the plan? He asked, stirring his coffee. I sighed. That's just it. I don't have one. I've got these messages, the GPS tracker, but I still feel like I don't know enough. Tom leaned back, studying me. You're doing better than most guys would. At least you're keeping a level head. Doesn't feel that way, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Look, Tom said, leaning forward. I know this sucks, but you need to focus. If you're going to confront her or him, you need everything. Times, dates, places. Get the full picture before you make a move. I nodded slowly. He was right, but the thought of digging deeper made my stomach turn. How do you even do that? I asked. I've already got the tracker and the app. What else is there? Tom smirked. Plenty. Surveillance cameras, audio recorders, even stuff that lets you monitor her computer. You can get all of it online if you know where to look. I frowned. That sounds extreme. Maybe, he said, shrugging. But isn't this worth it? You're not just trying to catch her in the act, you're protecting yourself. If this thing goes south, you'll need evidence for court, for everything. The mention of court hit me like a slap. Divorce wasn't something I'd even considered yet, but hearing Tom say it out loud made the possibility feel very real. That night, I found myself researching again. This time, I looked into tools that would let me monitor more than just her phone. I read reviews, watched tutorials, and made a list of what I might need. I hated every second of it. It felt wrong, like I was crossing some invisible line. But then, I'd think about those messages from Derek, and the anger would flare up again, drowning out the guilt. By the time Madison came home, I'd already ordered a small camera disguised as a USB charger and a voice recorder I could hide in the car. I woke up the next morning with one goal in mind. I wasn't going to let this slide. I'd spent too many sleepless nights, too many hours questioning myself, but now I had clarity. Madison thought she could outsmart me, but she underestimated my resolve. Around midday, I grabbed my keys and left the house before she could get back from work. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for her excuses or fake smiles. Instead, I headed downtown, stopping first at an electronics store. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I placed my items on the counter. a set of discrete cameras, a voice recorder, and a portable hard drive. Upgrading your home security? He asked with a smirk. Something like that, I said, my tone clipped. After leaving the store, I made a quick stop at a coffee shop to plan my next moves. I pulled out my phone and searched for tools to gather more evidence. Madison had already proven she wasn't going to tell me the truth willingly, so I had to be strategic. The GPS tracker and phone monitoring app had given me a glimpse into her secret world, but I needed more. Something irrefutable. That's when an idea struck me. Madison had always been meticulous about her schedule, keeping a physical planner on her desk at home. She liked to jot down important dates as a way of staying organized, or so she said. If she was meeting Derek somewhere, there might be a clue in there. I drove back home, arriving just as Madison's car pulled into the driveway. I stepped out, casually greeting her as she gathered her things. "How was work?" I asked, masking my emotions behind a neutral tone. "Busy as always," she said with a smile. "I'm exhausted. Maybe you should take it easy this weekend," I suggested. She shrugged. "I'll try, but we've got so much going on with the project." We walked into the house together, and as she went to the kitchen to make tea, I excused myself to the bedroom. Her planner sat on the desk, right where I thought it would be. I flipped through the pages, scanning for anything unusual. Most of it was standard: meetings, deadlines, reminders, but one entry stood out: a large red circle around the upcoming Friday. Next to it, she'd written, "Dinner with D, 7 p.m. My pulse quickened. I snapped a picture of the page with my phone and put the planner back in its place. That evening, while Madison was busy folding laundry, I set up one of the cameras in the living room. It was small enough to fit inside a decorative vase on the shelf, completely hidden from view. Another went in the bedroom, carefully placed behind the curtain rod. I told myself it wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. If Madison was bringing Derek into my home, I needed to know. The next few days were a blur of activity. I tested the cameras to make sure they worked, installed the voice recorder in her car, and even went back to the electronics store for a long-range microphone. By Thursday, everything was in place. I sat at the dining table that evening, pretending to read the news on my phone while Madison chatted about her day. "I might have to work late tomorrow," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Oh, big deadline?" "Yeah," she said quickly. "Derek wants to go over some last-minute changes." I nodded, hiding the anger bubbling just below the surface. By the time I decided to act, the anger inside me had hardened into something colder. It wasn't the kind of rage that made you lash out blindly. It was the focused, deliberate kind. The kind that sharpened my thoughts and gave me clarity. Madison had been playing me for a fool, but I wasn't going to confront her without a plan. If she thought she could get away with this, she was about to learn how wrong she was. That morning, I told her I'd be working late. She barely looked up from her coffee, giving me a half-hearted smile. "Don't work too hard," she said lightly. The irony wasn't lost on me. "You too," I replied, watching her carefully as she rinsed out her mug and headed upstairs to get ready for the day. Once she was gone, I grabbed a notebook and started laying out my plan. I wasn't just going to catch her in the act. I was going to make sure she couldn't lie her way out of it. The first step was getting some time off work. I drove to the office, met briefly with my boss, and explained that I needed a few personal days. "Family stuff," I said vaguely. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and told me to take whatever time I needed. From there, I headed to a store on the edge of town that specialized in surveillance equipment. The place was small and nondescript, the kind of shop you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Inside, a bored-looking clerk leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "Can I help you?" he asked, barely glancing up. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm looking for cameras, small ones, discreet." The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He led me to a display case filled with devices I'd only seen in spy movies. Cameras hidden in clocks, USB chargers, even pens. I picked out a few items: a camera disguised as a power bank, a voice recorder small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, and a GPS tracker that was even smaller than the one I'd already installed on Madison's car. "You starting a private detective business or something?" the clerk joked as he rang me up. "Something like that," I said, forcing a smile. After leaving the store, I stopped by a cafe to regroup. I ordered a coffee and sat in the corner, going over my purchases. Each device came with detailed instructions, but I'd already read enough online to know how they worked. The real challenge would be installing them without Madison noticing. When I got home, Madison wasn't there. She'd texted earlier, saying she was meeting a friend for lunch. I used the opportunity to install the new camera in the living room, tucking it inside a decorative vase on the bookshelf. Another went in the bedroom, hidden in the corner of the closet where it had a clear view of the room. By the time Madison returned, everything was in place. She walked in carrying a shopping bag and a cup of iced coffee, her mood light and carefree. "Good day?" I asked, watching her closely. "Yeah, it was nice to catch up with Jenna," she said, setting the bag on the counter. I nodded, pretending to scroll through my phone while she unpacked her things. Inside the bag was a new dress, sleek, black, and far too elegant for anything casual. What's the occasion? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Oh, just something I saw on sale, she said quickly, folding it and placing it in the closet. I didn't press her, but my suspicion grew. That night, I stayed up late, testing the cameras and making sure they were working properly. I adjusted the angles, checked the sound quality, and set up notifications on my phone so I'd know if there was any movement in the house while I was away. The next morning, Madison announced she was heading to yoga. Jenna said she's trying a new studio, she said, grabbing her mat and keys. I'll be back in a couple of hours. I smiled and waved her off, then opened the tracking app as soon as she was out of sight. Sure enough, her car wasn't heading to a yoga studio. It was going downtown. I watched as the blinking dot moved steadily toward the same hotel where she'd met Derek before. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more evidence, and this wasn't the time to confront her. By Friday evening, I was parked 2 streets away from my house, my car hidden under the shadow of an overgrown tree. I turned off the engine and the headlights, letting the quiet of the neighborhood envelop me. From this vantage point, I could see anyone coming or going without being noticed myself. I'd told Madison earlier that I'd be working late. It was a convenient excuse, one that let me slip away unnoticed while she prepared for her so-called work meeting. At exactly 6:30 p.m., her car rolled out of the driveway. I watched as she drove down the street, heading toward what I assumed would be her usual rendezvous point. But something made me pause before following. I opened the tracking app on my phone and watched the blinking dot representing her car. At first, it headed downtown, just as I'd expected, but then unexpectedly, it doubled back, turning toward our neighborhood. My stomach churned. She wasn't meeting Derek at the hotel tonight. She was bringing him here. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered driving off, giving myself time to think. But something inside me, the same cold, focused anger that had been driving me for weeks, refused to back down. Instead, I slowly backed my car out of its hiding spot and parked further down the street, out of sight. Turning off the ignition, I sat in the silence, watching the house from a distance. Minutes later, Madison's car pulled into the driveway. I saw her step out, adjusting her dress before walking up to the door. A second car pulled up behind hers, a sleek black sedan. Derek got out, looking every bit the smug bastard I'd imagined him to be. He followed Madison inside, laughing at something she'd said, his hand grazing her lower back. My fists clenched. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Storming in now would be satisfying, but it wouldn't accomplish what I needed. I had to stick to the plan. I grabbed my laptop and headphones from the passenger seat and quietly made my way into the house through the back door. My cameras were already in place, and I had full access to the feeds from the guest room. As I settled in, I switched on the laptop and watched them through the living room camera. Madison handed Derek a glass of wine, her laughter echoing through the house. They had no idea I was there. Friday evening arrived, and everything was finally in place. Madison had been cheerful all day, humming to herself as she prepared for her work meeting. She left the house at 6:30 p.m., slipping into that sleek black dress she'd claimed was on sale. "Don't wait up," she said with a playful smile as she walked out the door. I smiled back, my jaw tight. "Have a good night." As soon as the door closed, I moved into action. My phone buzzed with a notification from the camera app. The living room feed showed her stepping out, adjusting her dress in the hallway mirror before leaving. I switched to the GPS tracker and watched as her car headed downtown. But something changed this time. Instead of stopping at the usual hotel, the tracker showed her circling back toward our neighborhood. My heart pounded. She wasn't meeting Derek at the hotel. She was bringing him here. For a moment, I was frozen, caught between disbelief and a growing fury. Then I grabbed my laptop, phone, and a set of headphones, setting up in the guest room where I had access to the camera feeds. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, the living room camera buzzed with movement. Madison walked in, Derek right behind her. A smug grin plastered across his face. "Nice place," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Mark's working late," Madison replied, slipping out of her heels. "We'll have plenty of time." I clenched my fists, barely holding back the urge to storm out and confront them right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched as they moved from the living room to the kitchen. Derek leaned against the counter, laughing at something Madison said. She poured them both glasses of wine, her smile far too wide for someone who claimed to be stressed from work. This is just the beginning, I thought to myself. As Madison led Derek into the bedroom, their laughter floated through the night air, faint but audible, even from where I sat in my car. I clenched my jaw, my hand hovering over the phone that displayed the live feed from the cameras. They acted like they owned the place. Derek's cocky smirk Madison's light-hearted giggle. It was as if they were mocking me, turning the home we'd built into their personal playground. I hit record on every feed, capturing their movements, their laughter, their shameless disregard. My lawyer's advice echoed in my mind. You need irrefutable evidence. I had it now, more than enough. But watching wasn't enough. It never was. I opened the app controlling the smart speaker system I'd linked to my laptop earlier. With a few taps, I queued up the live audio feed from the bedroom camera, broadcasting their voices into the living room and kitchen. Madison's laughter rang out through the house. What the hell? Derek's voice was suddenly sharp, his bravado faltering. Madison's tone shifted to panic. What's going on? I stayed in my car, giving them a moment to stew in their confusion. The sound of their betrayal echoed through the home like a confession, loud and undeniable. Then, with deliberate slowness, I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front door. I didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, my boots crunching against the gravel driveway as I approached. My chest was tight with anger, but my mind was cold and focused. Inside, I could hear them scrambling, their panic mounting as they tried to make sense of what was happening. I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. The sound carried through the house, loud and deliberate. "Who's there?" Derek called out, his voice cracking. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the bedroom door and opened it without knocking. Madison and Derek froze, their faces a perfect blend of shock and fear. Madison sat on the edge of the bed, her hand gripping a glass of wine. Derek stood next to her, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "Don't stop on my account," I said coldly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your work meeting." Madison stammered. "Mark, this isn't—" "Leave it," I snapped, my eyes locking onto hers. "I've been watching you two for weeks. Every text, every call, every time you thought I wasn't paying attention, it's all recorded." Derek tried to speak, raising his hands as if to calm me. "Look, man, this isn't what it looks like." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like. And don't worry, I've got it all on tape. So don't bother trying to explain." He opened his mouth again, but I cut him off, pointing toward the door. "You've got 5 minutes to get out of my house, or I'll make sure your wife gets a copy of this footage before the night's over." Derek's confidence shattered. He grabbed his jacket and practically bolted out of the room, leaving Madison sitting on the bed, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me explain." I shook my head slowly, my expression blank. "Explain? You don't get to explain, Madison. Not anymore. Pack your things and leave. I want you out of here by tomorrow." After Derek left, I locked myself in the guest room, replaying the footage to make sure I had everything. The relief I felt was bittersweet. On one hand, I finally had closure. On the other, the marriage I thought I had was nothing more than a lie. That night, I sent the recordings to my lawyer, along with a message. I'm ready to move forward. Madison tried to talk to me the next morning, but I didn't give her the chance. I left the house before she woke up, driving aimlessly for hours, before finally pulling into a quiet park. I sat there staring out at the trees, letting the reality of it all sink in. I wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let Madison or Derek walk away unscathed. Madison didn't leave quietly. The next morning, as I packed a bag and prepared to leave the house for a few days, she followed me from room to room, begging for another chance. "Mark, please," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I made a mistake. We can fix this." "You know we can." I didn't look at her. "A mistake, Madison? One night is a mistake. Months of lies? That's a choice." She grabbed my arm, her tears flowing freely now. "I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't throw everything away." I stopped, finally meeting her eyes. "You already did that. The moment you decided I wasn't enough." I pulled away and walked out the door without another word. Madison didn't leave quietly. The next morning, as I packed a bag and prepared to leave the house for a few days, she followed me from room to room, begging for another chance. "Mark, please," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I made a mistake. We can fix this. You know we can." I didn't look at her. "A mistake, Madison? One night is a mistake. Months of lies? That's a choice." She grabbed my arm, her tears flowing freely now. "I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't throw everything away." I stopped, finally meeting her eyes. "You already did that. The moment you decided I wasn't enough." I pulled away and walked out the door without another word. "I had no idea," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me." Angela wasn't just furious, she was relentless. Within days, Derek's life began to unravel. Angela filed for divorce, taking with her not only their assets, but also a mountain of evidence she brought to his company's HR department. A week later, I got a call from Tom. "Did you hear?" he asked, barely able to contain his amusement. "Hear what?" "Derek Caldwell got canned. HR said something about a breach of company ethics. Looks like your evidence found its way to the right people." I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Derek had lost everything: his job, his wife, and the polished reputation he'd worked so hard to maintain. As for Madison, she tried to salvage her own life, but the damage was done. Word of the affair spread quickly among our social circle, and she found herself shunned by people who once called her a friend. I didn't go out of my way to ruin her. I didn't need to. Her actions spoke for themselves. In the weeks that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The house, once tainted with memories of her betrayal, now felt like my space again. I replaced the furniture, painted the walls, and removed every trace of Madison from my life. One afternoon, as I sat on the back porch with a cold beer in hand, Tom joined me. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what's next for you?" I thought about it for a moment. "I don't know. But for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of the future." Tom raised his bottle in a toast. "To fresh starts." "To fresh starts," I echoed, clinking my bottle against his.